Hello and welcome to the Unlocking Behaviour Change Podcast. My name is Jamie West. I'm a writer, performer and musician, and I am joined by Professor Emeritus Robert West. How are you doing today, Robert?
I'm doing really well. And before we go any further, I just want to say what a joy it was to be at yours and Alia's gig last night. I thought it was a fantastic show. Any of the listeners who live anywhere near South London, and particularly Morden, I'm not giving too much away in terms of where you live, Jamie, in case people want to track you down. There is a wonderful cafe down there where Jamie has a sort of a spot every now and then with other performers, and it was a joy.
Well, yeah, thank you for coming. Yeah, there's a really cool cafe in Morden, South London in the United Kingdom, because I know we've got listeners from all over the world. So if you're ever in London, there's a cool music cafe called Metronome, and they have a studio out back as well where we rehearse, but other people record and do things. And we have a fun time putting on shows there. We did quite a few last year, and this was actually, it's at the end of the year. We've been busy doing other things, but it was our first one and our last one of this year. Yeah. But hopefully do a bit more next year. So, yeah, I'm a bit tired today, but it was fun, and it's nice to be here recording the podcast, nice and relaxed. So we are talking about group decision-making. And I thought we'd talk a bit today about sort of voting systems. That is a big way in which groups make decisions. And there's all different kinds of voting systems, and they have all kinds of implications for how the group interacts and a final decision or decisions are reached.
You could say that voting systems and democracy are perhaps the most important group decisions that are made in sort of current society. And they're a beautiful example of what the challenges are to arriving at a, let's call it truly, if there is such a thing, democratic decision, because it's a group decision because the group is making the decision. It's not an individual. Individuals contribute to it, but ultimately you've got to figure out what you as a group want to do. And of course, it's not just elections for governments and things like that. You have voting systems for all kinds of group decisions. And the question then becomes, as has been debated over centuries, many centuries, what are the best voting systems in these kinds of scenarios? And they're not always going to be the same for every kind of group decision that you have to make. But as is well known for people who study politics or even have a vague interest in politics in the UK, for example, we have a what seems to be rather strange voting system in a way, called what they call the first past the post system, for individual seats in national government in Westminster. And so we have 600 and something MPs. Each MP has a constituency. In that constituency, a number of people will vie for voter preference in the general election or in by-elections. And the person, it's called first past the post because the person who gets the most votes wins that seat. Now, it should be pretty obvious, and it is obvious to everyone living in the UK, that can result in some rather strange anomalies, not least in the last general election in the UK, where the Labour government got a large majority of MPs in the House of Commons, despite only getting about a third, just over a third, of the votes nationally. And you think, blimey, how could, that's crazy. It's actually in many ways even worse in systems that you have in the United States. But it happens because each vote only counts in your region or in your particular area, your constituency. And if there are, let's say, 5 candidates, the candidate who wins could still be only getting a minority of votes. at an extreme case, for example, the person who wins might get 30% of the votes, but all the other candidates get something less than 30 split between them. Okay, so the person who's got in that seat is actually not someone who the majority of people want. So that leaves that, and this can become accentuated where you've got a situation, for example, where in some constituencies you get a particular candidate for a particular party could get, let's say, 70 or 80% of the vote. It's a done deal. That seat is never going to change, and so people feel, well, what's the point in voting in that seat? The elections are only won or lost at government level with a few what they call swing seats, which seems to undermine the whole concept of democracy. So in other voting systems, you've got other approaches. So, for example, some have what they call a party list system and a proportional representation where you're not necessarily voting for an individual in a particular constituency, but you're voting for a party. But the problem there is that then the party gets to decide who the MPs are, and sort of a huge amount of power is wielded by the party apparatchiks who create the party lists. And anyway, long story short, it turns out, looking at the maths of it, which is very interesting, that none, and I'm not kidding here, none of the voting systems that currently operates for electing governments in the world is immune to kind of irrationalities that arise out of particular combinations of votes. And when you think about it, it's not that surprising because let's say you've got a family of 5 people, and let's say each of those people, let's say 2 of those people want to go to the cinema. One person wants to go out to a restaurant, one person wants to stay at home, and one person wants to go to a rock concert. There is literally no way, in that case, looking at people's first preferences, of satisfying the needs of the majority of people. It's just not logically possible. So this idea that you could ever potentially satisfy the first preferences of a majority of people in a voting system is just not feasible. Sometimes it might happen if you're lucky, but there's no guarantee in any voting system that would happen. And so when people sort of argue that the British system or the Westminster system of the first past the post has this unfortunate consequence that governments can get in with a minority of votes from the population, yeah. What are you going to do? If you try and construct a system in which you can sort of always defeat the maths and the logic of it, you're just simply not going to succeed.
There is a sense with voting systems in democracies that they try to be quite careful in constructing these voting systems that the quote-unquote majority may not actually get what they want, right? Because of trying to protect against populism.
Yeah.
So I find it a very sort of interesting subject to explore. It feels a bit risky even talking about it because there is this kind of, it's as though, well, there are these people who think they're so superior and they think, oh, well, actually the masses can't be trusted. So there is that. I think that's the risk of that kind of argument. But the risk of allowing populism to take over is another risk on the other side.
It is. And as you say, it's getting into tricky territory there because, of course, it could be true, theoretically and in practice, that a majority of people might want something that is just horrendous. They in the UK, they might, vote to if you gave them a chance in a referendum, for example,
yeah.
as has been known, they might vote to do something that ultimately was quite damaging to the population.
Just imagine.
Yes, I mean, I think it's true. It certainly was true until very recently that a majority of people in the UK were favoured bringing back hanging, capital punishment. So you don't. It's interesting. This, that you don't. We kind of fudge it because it's a terrible thing to have to say. In a voting system, that democracy doesn't necessarily give you, or a majority vote doesn't necessarily give you a good answer. And why? And of course, why would you expect it to? Because particularly on certain matters, it's not that the majority of people are not necessarily particularly well versed in the pros and the cons and the consequences of something. But even when you take that out of, let's say, national government or local government into areas of voting, let's say, on a committee to do a particular decision, let's say it's the board of a company voting to, give a pay rise to, the CEO or something like that. Each person in that group is not necessarily going to be fully au fait with all the consequences and so on. And of course, in the lead up to that vote, all kinds of shenanigans and communications and persuasion and so on can go on, which would
outright lying,
and of course, outright lying, could go on, and bribery and heaven only knows what. So democracy is very, very far from being a guarantee of a good decision. But having said that, what it does do is to potentially, under the right circumstance, provide the stakeholders in a group decision to with an opportunity to say no. But this is so, what you're doing is so bad and is so bad for me that I'm not having it. And the alternative, which is that, some sort of oligarchy or dictatorship or something like that within a committee or within a population, has obviously got to be potentially a lot worse. There has to be accountability. And so democracy's job, I think the way to think about it is democracy's job is not necessarily to come up with the best decision, because that would be asking a bit much, but to introduce the notion of accountability for decisions among those who are enacting them.
I think I agree with that. I was thinking just the other day that actually the great power of democracy is voting someone out. Because in terms of who we vote in, that tends to be quite limited, actually, in terms of what we can do as a group. And especially just someone who's just a resident in a constituency, maybe they're not particularly politically active and they're busy with other things, or that's just not their interest. They're going to have maybe two candidates to choose from realistically, right?
Yeah,
so that's it. That's who they've got, two candidates. That's not a massive choice. But if you want to get rid of somebody, you can get rid of anybody. And I like that system, because you can go, okay, actually, this person's gone mad. This leader has gone mad, or this representative, the power has gone to their head, or something's happened in their life. Who knows what's going on? But if somebody just has unchecked power, we see what happens. It's a nightmare.
Yeah.
And they become murderous if they can. I mean, that's just what happens.
Yeah. So I think you're right. It's the idea that you can in principle get rid of someone, but there is also a rub. And I think one of the principles here about decision making is that very often in decisions, you're making choices between things that none of which you want. Actually, what's happening in a lot of so-called democracies in the West at the moment is people having to make decisions between parties, usually, which they don't have any faith in, because they've lost the trust of the people, because they've failed to deliver, or they've said that they were going to do one thing and they've actually gone and done something else, and then you're basically stuck with them for another 5 years. But here's the problem with the, deciding, that idea that you can vote people out is that if you vote them out, then who are you voting in? So if we take the situation in the UK at the moment, where we've got Labour in power, the Conservatives are on a very, very low popularity, and the Reform Party are probably the least unpopular, shall we say, of the parties. You could find yourself in a classic sort of frying pan fire situation where you go, right, I'm voting this lot out because they're useless. And then who comes in? Another lot who are even worse. And that brings back the thing that we mentioned, which I brought up last week, and I've mentioned probably a couple of times, which is this crucial distinction between what you desire and what you're willing to accept. We talked about it in relation to negotiations, but it's also an incredibly important principle when it comes to group decision-making of this kind, voting, because you've got to think, oh my God, these people, Labour terrible, Tories terrible, blah, blah, blah. And then the natural thing to want to do is to go, well, I'm going to go for someone else who's never been in government, who's never done anything. And, they've got to be better than this lot. But they don't have to be better than this lot. They could be a lot worse. And you've got to think, okay, you've got to, maybe sometimes in decisions, you've got to just grit your teeth and go, I got to vote for these people, however much I dislike them, because the alternative is even worse. And that's a horrible thing to have to do.
It's really tricky. And it's going to be a very difficult campaign coming up in a few years for Labour, when that probably will be the subtext of what they're going to try to get people to do, which is to say, it's either us or this party that is led by somebody who, we're not going to go into him, but put it this way: the history and even the present behavior of that person is questionable, to say the least.
Yeah.
So but it's very, very tricky for people to. I sometimes think it's one of the ways in which group decisions can often go very wrong is what you've just described. That is the classic way in which you can actually, something really bad, you can go down a really bad road. And it seems to sort of make sense at every step of the way. You go, and people who are not that engaged, they just kind of go, that should be better, and roughly in this direction should be okay. When actually it could be a very dangerous, and that this is what has happened. And I think that's what people are so concerned about in general, is that the kind of stability that we've been used to, in which you can kind of whinge and complain, but it's kind of bearable. You're willing to put up with it. It's kind of just is going to be replaced with something much worse. And suddenly the previous period is going to look really good, which you thought was awful.
I know. So that then, because that's very uncomfortable, right? Okay. But also, it's not the end of the story, because, yes, if you say, right, these are the only choices, and, is it A, which is terrible, B, which is even worse, or C, which is even worse than that, therefore I go with one of these. That decision frame, going back to the facet model, is a fixed frame. Now, in many decisions, then what you really need to do is to say, I don't accept the premise of this. I don't accept this frame. There's got to be something else. Now, when it comes to political decisions, that can be a long process. So, for example, what's happening in the UK is that, another party has just been formed, which is kind of like the Labour Party was before Keir Starmer took it over, and his crew took it over. But essentially, the idea is that there's a whole massive number of sort of disaffected Labour people who are joining together, probably with some other people as well, to form this sort of alternative. Now, how that's going to pan out, heaven only knows. It's incredibly difficult in the current political system to create, in the UK anyway, to create a new party that could take power in its first attempt at a general election. So it seems, quite a big ask. But you have to think maybe longer term than that and think, okay, we start something. If you think about when the Labour Party started out first off, it took a while for it to sort of get hold. And become, one of the two major parties. So what I'm saying is that in something like national politics in the UK with our current voting system, then it's going to be a big ask to change the frame. But that's what people are doing or trying to do. And if you think over a longer time period, maybe that's something that could be successful. I hope so, personally, for all our sakes. But in other kinds of decisions where it looks as though there's a fixed choice, it can be a lot easier to change the frame and say, well, hang on a minute, it's not just A and B or A, B and C that we're voting for. There's another option that, which might combine a bit of A and a bit of B. And I think it's really useful for people to, when they're making these sort of group decisions, to always have in mind when there is no acceptable option to think of alternatives. A classic example in appointment decisions is just you say, well, we're not going to appoint. You've got 2 candidates or 3 candidates, and after you've interviewed them, you think, well, actually, none of them really is what we need. Okay, well, we'll re-advertise. So the re-advertising construct, I think, is something that we always need to bear in mind. Doesn't always work because sometimes there's time pressures or there's other things, and you've got no reason to believe that if you try and expand the range of options that it's going to do any good. But it's always worth considering that as a possibility.
And I suppose in a company, you, as opposed to, the country, you have a much better chance of restructuring whatever systems are in place that you have power over yourself, so that, or even in the group decision that you have, you can go, this isn't working. Can we find a new solution to how we make our decisions as a board? Can we find a new solution? Who do we want to include? And of course, those tend to be they are incredibly fraught. They are all essentially what I would call political decisions, even at a very small level. And I have found, maybe I've mentioned it before, a tennis club that I'm part of, I have never been on the board or anything, but I've been around people as they've been arguing about something like floodlights or something it's not small, of course, but it's pretty small fry compared with national politics, but people take it just about as seriously as they take anything else. I think it's like the same mechanisms get triggered in our brain at a large level and a small level. And that's why it's sort of, you have to have a game. You have to have the fun of it. I think it's not really my sort of thing, but I think the people who tend to be successful are ones who can appreciate the seriousness of what they're doing, while also kind of enjoying the game of it, which is, I think those people tend to be a bit more successful.
Yes, I think you may well be right, and I think one of the things I've found as I've got older is more of an ability to be a bit detached about it. But one of the things I want to say in relation to that, which is really critical in any voting system, is that what you can't do, what really, really doesn't work, is where you have a system and then it comes up with a result that some people don't like. And then people go, well, I don't like that system. And so essentially they say, well, no, I don't accept that. And it's, you can do that. The trouble is that you're moving into very dangerous territory, because then someone else is going to say, well, I don't like the system that you are proposing. And you end up with basically anarchy. So again, it goes back to this issue of willingness. Democracy or democratic systems of any sort absolutely depend on the vast majority of people saying, it may not deliver the result that I want, But it's more important that we pursue that system than that we if it doesn't deliver what I want, that we throw it out and say, we're going to do something else, because that way does lie anarchy, and that would be worse.
It's amazing how many of our conversations, to my mind, seem to come back to a principle which seems to hold both on a personal level, a political level as well, which is that the process is what you need to focus on, and the outcome is out of your control, really. But you need to keep focusing on the process. And of course, you may need to change the process. You need to try and keep the integrity of the process, and that is key, and especially when under stress, which is when you're thinking, oh God. And it's not that you shouldn't analyze and improve the process, but the tendency can be to just throw the process completely out, and then you get focused on all the wrong things.
Yeah, absolutely. So if it can happen with individual decisions, it can happen with group decisions, the best process that you could possibly come up with delivers a result that you don't want. That can happen because of the way the world is. And there's two things there. One is, as you absolutely rightly say, to remember that your best chances of success are in having the best process, but also it goes to something else that we've been saying, which is that when you arrive at a decision, a lot of times that is the starting point. And then the next thing you've got to do is say, well, this is the decision and I've got to make it work. So whatever decision you come up with, that, so much of what turns it into a good or a bad decision actually is making that decision work.
Yeah, I like that idea because it takes some of the stress off constantly looking back and regretting the decision and regretting the process. And sometimes that's okay, because a little bit of that might be healthy, I would imagine, because there may be a gap where you can alter your decision. But there are times when you can't do that, or you can't alter it significantly. And then you're kind of going, okay, let's just kind of put as much of the past behind us as we can. And where are we now? What can we do right now? And try and let go of the baggage, which takes time. It's a process, but then you have the best chance of going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm reminded, I think it was a Tom Stoppard play in which one of the characters says, we have to cross our bridges when we come to them and burn them behind us.
Yeah, well, that's a lovely note to end on. Oh, and a little tribute to Tom Stoppard, who I know was one of your favorite playwrights, wrote one of your favorite plays, at least, Rosencrest and Guildenstern Are Dead. Yeah. And anyway, that brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you so much, Robert. Thank you at home for listening, wherever you may be. Did I say at home? Well, wherever you may be.
At home, wherever that may be.
Wherever your home may be, yeah. Have a look at the links in the description, as always, and we look forward to joining you next time on the Unlocking Behaviour Change podcast.